Robinson hit that ball. It went zooming across the left field wall. Yeah, boy.
Yes, yes, Jackie hit that ball.
And when he swung his bat, the crowd went wild because he knocked that ball a solid mile. Yeah, boy.
Yes, yes, Jackie hit that ball. Satchel Paige is mellow, so is Campanella, Newcomb and Dobie too. But it's a natural fact, when Jackie comes to bat, the other team is through.
Did you see Jackie Robinson hit that ball? Did he hit it? Yes, and that ain't all. He's so home.
Yes, yes, Jackie's real gone. Jackie's real gone. 'Cause Jackie is a real gone
Can you catch? Will you hold the ball when you step to the plate? Will you swing and fall? If you play, you gotta know how it's done. Can you catch? Can you hold a hard one? I mean, baby, do you know the game? I mean, baby, do you know the game? I'm a big league pitcher. Can you catch the hairline sling? Can you hit ball I throw to you? Southpaw, can you hit ball I throw to you? But get your bat ready, baby. Let's see what you can do. Do you, baby, know what it's all about? Do you, baby, know what it's all about?
I'm Fran Charles inside Studio 42. Today is Jackie Robinson Day. Baseball paying tribute to the man who broke the game's color barrier in 1947. But Jackie's fight for equality was certainly not limited to what he did on the diamond. We found several speeches Jackie gave in the mid to late 60s that addressed race issues well past Jackie's playing days. Here now, in his own words, is Jackie Robinson from close to 60 years ago. Amazing how current they sound now.
I have been moved by the cause that brings so many of you out day in and day out, putting your lives on the line so that America can be free.
When we think about this picture, just sickens me. This big brave policeman down here with his knee on the throat of this lady. And I think the conscience of America is beginning to awaken.
There's not an American in this country free until every one of us are free. I think that it's a tragedy that white Americans can take the attitude denying people opportunities based simply on skin coloring.
Until people in positions of power here in Washington are willing to stand up and be counted, the very same way that leadership saved baseball back in '47. Because had it not been for the firmness of a Rickey, we could have had serious trouble in 1947.
Now, people have been saying that, yes, but Jackie Robinson, of all people here in this country, you have less right to protest against what's going on than anybody that I know of. They said, Jackie Robinson, you have it made, and you ought not to be a part of this movement. And I say to you that whether you like it or not, and whether you think that we ought to participate, that there is not one Negro, not one that I know in this country, that has it made until the most underprivileged Negro in St. Augustine, Florida has it made. Talk to our friends. Let everybody know that we really are at the crossroads. They can no longer sit on the fence. They've got to get off of it and join the struggle if we are to achieve equality and freedom in our time.
And greetings from the heart of America in Kansas City, Missouri. Welcome to Baseball Book Notes. I'm Raymond Doswell, and we're broadcasting live from the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. Thank you all for tuning in tonight, especially those of you on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. We want to remind you that you can also be part of the program by offering questions through the chat feature on your platform. So we will offer brief introductions to our esteemed panel and guests here shortly for you to review, and we'll be adding extra information about them as we go through the program. So tonight's program is part of the Red Line series presented by Johnson County Museum. A Red Line is an exhibition and educational program and a year-long examination of race in our community. Go to jcprd.com/redline for more details and information. Now, we want to encourage you also to visit the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum Tuesday through Sundays, or you can visit online at www.nlbm.com. And I want to correct the Twitter handle there. It should be NLB Museum KC. That is on Twitter. We welcome your comments on Twitter as well. Now, tonight we're going to discuss the legacy of Jackie Robinson. He was born in 1919 in Cairo, Georgia. His family escaped sharecropping and migrated to Pasadena, California when he was an infant. He rose above poverty and became a dynamic multi-sport athlete, military veteran, an icon of business and civil rights. Of course, we know he was more than a ball player, but in the time that he played with the Kansas City Monarchs and Brooklyn Dodgers, he ranks among the greatest players of all time, as well as a sports pioneer for having broken baseball's long-standing color barrier in 1947. Now, what's important is that this year, 2022, marks the 75th anniversary of his debut with the Brooklyn Dodgers, breaking that color barrier. And tonight we want to discuss his legacy with the panel of distinguished Robinson scholars and friends of the museum. We're pleased to have Dr. David Naze in our program. He's the author of Reclaiming Robinson, Public Memory and the Reframing of Jackie Robinson's Radical Legacy. We're also very pleased to have Kostya Kennedy, who joins us here. His most recent work is doing great in sales all over the country. Is titled True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson. We're also pleased to have our very good friend and journalist and author, Sridhar Pappu, who joins the panel tonight. And among his many works, he is one of the contributors to the book 42 Today, Jackie Robinson and His Legacy. And what can we say about our great friend, Dr. Michael G. Long, who has worked on several volumes about Jackie Robinson, including his latest, Call Him Jack, the story of Jackie Robinson, Black Freedom Fighter. Now, our very good friend, Dr. Randal Jelks, who's also a contributor to the 42 Today volume, is going to moderate our discussion. And we're going to turn it over to him here shortly to introduce our guests some more and to take the floor and lead the discussion. So, Dr. Jelks, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doswell. Appreciate all the panelists who've taken the time tonight to join us and have fun in the discussion about Robinson. There are so many ways that we can cover Robinson, and there are so many narratives about Robinson. And as I was thinking about as the show was opening, it's just the music alone in the swing era of jazz, so that Robinson gets seen in the swing era. So it would be very, very interesting to even take that kind of narrative about Robinson, the popular music of baseball, especially coming out of African American communities where swing jazz was at the forefront of people dancing and celebrating. I don't think of today. Is there a hip hop song on baseball, gentlemen? Are you aware of anybody making anything about baseball? Even I watched the other day. Finished watching the documentary on Derek Jeter. Although he was in attendance, I don't remember a hip hop song about Jeter on the way that people swung around Robinson. So let's begin. I mean, what do you think about music in Robinson? And what do you think about the song? Mike Long challenged me to sing it, but I'm like, I'm not that good, and it would run the audience off. But let's start there. I mean, because that's an interesting part of his narrative. I mean, people, how the ways he was popularized. Anybody? Well, David. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, he was popularized. That was sort of these novelty songs were part of the era in that time. Joe DiMaggio had a Joe DiMaggio song. It was something that sort of came along, and big band swing adopted cultural heroes and certainly athletes for these songs. Of course, music later in Robinson's life was a critical part of his contribution to the civil rights movement and the jazz concerts that he and Rachel would host in their home in Stamford, where, you know, the neighbors would suddenly be in their bedroom and think they heard Ella Fitzgerald singing and look out, and there was Ella Fitzgerald along. So they embraced jazz and raised a lot of money in that way, and that to me is probably the deepest and most resonant connection of music in the Robinson legacy.
Well, it's the way the sport is popularized, right? I mean, baseball is not. I mean, in my teen years, just listening, or early graduate school years, listening to Harry Carey saying "Take Me Out to the Ballpark," but nobody else is singing any other songs about the teams and so forth. Anybody else have a comment on that? I just think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because Robinson was popularized, and that's one of the ways he was popularized through the music and the artists who also appreciated what he was going through. So.
Well, I just sort of think it just sort of speaks to the general way he was popularized. I mean, the fact that he was able to star in his own movie, the Jackie Robinson story, and when Chadwick Boseman died, I went back and looked at the transcript. I haven't listened to the audio, and I remember Rachel telling me when he was cast, and we were sitting there, and he goes, we have Harrison Ford, and we have the person who played Jack, and you don't know him, he's been in these things, but I think he would do okay. And I said, is he gonna be a better actor than your husband? She goes, I hope so. Like something like that. So it's like, that's how I think this speaks to how big of a cultural force he was.
Right.
The fact that, I mean, as Kostya said, the Joe DiMaggio song and that, but when we're talking about football will always point to the fact that Paul Brown did in fact integrate, and correct me if I'm wrong, did integrate American sports before Robinson, but the force in which he was able to, where baseball was in America, right, and what a cultural icon he was. The fact that he was able to star in his own movie with Ruby Dee, the fact that he was to be this cultural force with things like the song and all these kinds of things, it just speaks to who he was in America. And then the fact that he was able to take that, and then from the second he walked out of Ebbets Field, that moment, and carry that on into the movement, like we just saw in the MLB movie, the presentation just now. It really it shows what a cultural force he was in America in the 21st century or 20th century.
Anybody else about that kind of popular cultural legacy of Robinson that is so much gets sort of underplayed? Mike, do you have any comments on that? You've written a ton on Robinson.
Yeah, no, I don't really have any comments to add to that, other than to say that sports pages were a lot bigger than they are now, and Robinson appeared throughout there. He wrote a column early on in his career, and so his cultural impact came there as well. In addition to the songs and in addition to the movie, it played out primarily through the sports pages.
And Dave, would you have any more to add to this?
Yeah, I think, there is an interesting connection. I think someone just mentioned, it's not necessarily a direct connection to music per se, but Jackie Robinson's connection with Paul Robeson at that particular time, who at that time, early on in Jackie Robinson's career, so in the late 1940s, Paul Robeson is arguably, if not, substantively, the most popular and well-known, the most famous, Black American at that particular time. And of course, there was this, I wouldn't necessarily argue that it was a rift. It was certainly perhaps more of a manufactured or somewhat, partisan narrative about, Paul Robeson versus Jackie Robinson and who represents Black America and et cetera, and who represents democracy versus communism, et cetera. But it was that particular division, however you want to describe it, between the two, where people were kind of taking sides, so to speak. But Paul Robeson being a particularly famous, somebody said, he'd integrated, sports. When he was an athlete, then he goes to law school, then he becomes a very famous singer and actor. The most famous person, Black American in America at the time. And so you kind of got these almost like these two camps, so to speak. And one's a very famous entertainer, one's an entertainer in a different realm. In terms of sports, but yet they both transcend and transformed and cultivated both of their different spaces in a political context as well. So you've got baseball coming into the political realm, and you've got entertainment in terms of singing and dancing entering the political realm as well, in a fight for, identity politics and Black America, white America, mainstream, all, et cetera. So that's definitely, I think there's some kind of peripheral connection between Robinson and music and politics.
Well, I think that's a good connection because, of course, as we all know, that Robinson is called before the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify, and he's going to be asked questions about Paul Robeson, in which he astutely gives a political answer, in what I think is a political answer to what would be alleged Robeson's alleged comments about whether Black Americans would fight would not fight for the United States in World War II and afterwards. And fight for the Soviet Union. All of those were trapped. So those played out themselves in kind of competing narratives of who was most American. One of the things I just wanted to say is that I know Paul Brown integrated football, but football was not America's sport at that time. I mean, it was baseball. Undoubtedly, was not basketball. Everybody went to baseball games, and that held for a long period of time. The other question I've sort of been thinking about is there are multiple Jackie Robinsons. I mean, we forget that he was an All-American in football. So at that stage of his life, his brother was a potential Olympian. So there are multiple Robinsons, and I wondered if you want to tell the audiences the ways you all have approached looking at Robinson, since this is book notes. So how have your particular books and your writing on Robinson approached him? So for our audience who may be unfamiliar with your writings, and we can start from my top. So I'll start with Mike Long, and then we'll go down to Kostya, David, and then Sridhar.
Well, I'll talk about my approach in light of the Robeson story in some ways. I think early on I focused primarily on the big newspapers that were writing at the time of Robinson's baseball career. And so I looked at New York Times, New York Post, Daily News, and so forth and so on. As time went on, I focused more on the Black newspapers, and especially the New York Amsterdam News and the Chicago Defender and so forth. And wow, did they ever approach the Robeson Robinson story in different ways. And so in the New York Times and the other big white newspapers, they focused on Robinson's critical response to Robeson. But in the Black newspapers, they really focused on Robinson's criticism of white America. And my approach changed with that. As I delved more deeply into the Black newspapers, I developed a sharper criticism of Robinson's views of the United States, and sort of saw Robinson in ways that I hadn't earlier. And I thank the Black newspapers especially for that. And so I became more critical of white society through their eyes. And I sort of read Robinson in a more expansive way, thanks to the Black newspapers. But so as my research delved more deeply in the Black newspapers, my approach to Robinson changed, no doubt about it.
I'd say, staying with this theme of that time period of Paul Robeson, my book looks at 4 seasons of Robinson, and they're figurative seasons. So there's a figurative spring, summer, autumn, and winter of his public life. And 1949, which is the year that we've been talking about here, when he went down to the House Un-American Committee and spoke, addressed the Robeson situation with 1949, the figurative summer. And one thing, it's really interesting what Michael says, and I want to just give a hat tip. Michael's done such wonderful work. It's been very influential for me and in my research and thought. So grateful for that. Newspapers, Black newspapers or white newspapers, they're trying to sell newspapers. And so they take an angle that they want their audience to respond to and want to read about. In this particular case, I think that the African American newspapers were far more accurate in many ways. It was a 25-paragraph speech written by Lester Granger that he gave down there at the House Committee on Un-American Activities. One paragraph addressed Paul Robeson. It was a very pointed paragraph, and he went right after him, and he genuinely disagreed with him. Jackie was very anti-communist. He argued with Martin Luther King about communism. He was anti-communist through and through. So that was a genuine disagreement with Paul Robeson. But he used the opportunity to criticize not having access to what white America had access to, not only Robinson, but all Black Americans. And so I guess the last thing relating back to your question is that for me, it gave a way to see Robinson was also a pretty young man. He was 30 years old. Robeson was in his early 50s. And he was relatively new. Somebody mentioned earlier that he had a column early on, but at that point he had refused writing a column. He didn't really want to step into the melee. But now this is the third year in the league, and Branch Rickey very much wanted him to go down and take on Robeson down there. Was one of his early steps into sort of slipping the bounds of the game and becoming a larger figure. Of course, just by breaking the color barrier, he immediately became a social and political figure by the act alone. But that year and that event was really, to me, one of the watershed moments of him actively stepping out of the Fauconian March, so to speak, off the ball field and into the public arena.
Yeah, and I'll actually echo a sentiment that Kostya just mentioned, and that is, I've always got to give a significant tip of the cap, so to speak, to Mike Long. It was his work in his 2000 book about Jackie Robinson and his civil rights letters. That was a seminal work that really opened my eyes to the political legacy of Jackie Robinson, because as a baseball fan, when I was beginning my doctoral program, my academic research, I knew I wanted to focus on baseball or sports and politics, and it was initially I was focusing more and more on the history and legacy of the Negro Leagues. And as I delved a little bit further into it, and my political interests started to become cultivated and formed at that particular time, I just kind of found myself coming back and back to Jackie Robinson and learning more and more about the narratives that we had not heard from a mainstream historical perspective. And so I really started to focus on, why is it that someone who's such a big baseball fan and amateur historian like myself and interested in politics doesn't really know, or has not really ever been taught or really heard a whole lot about that particular identity of Jackie Robinson, and that is his political legacy. So I started delving more into it and found it absolutely fascinating. And then Kostya just pointed out, talking about Jackie Robinson in his the first year in the league versus his third year in the league. And then really what started to captivate me was his post-playing career. Particularly right before he dies, he shows up in the World Series in 1972 to celebrate the 25th anniversary of him breaking the color barrier. And once again, like we've heard with some of the other previous sentiments, he's there. They think they're bringing him out to commemorate the 25th anniversary, but at the same time, this is him telling. He has the camera. He's telling the audience. He's telling America, "Boy, this is great that we've been able to break the barrier." But at the same time, what don't we have? We don't have a manager over at third base. We don't have a manager in the dugout. We don't have a front office executive or an ownership that reflects, people of my community. And that's where we are falling short, and we need to continue to move forward if we really want to say that we've truly broken a barrier. And so that's, and that's not necessarily something that is typically included in the mainstream commemorations of him. Maybe those of us that have followed his life and career know quite a bit about it, or Jackie Robinson enthusiasts, but it's not typically something that is part of the contemporary mainstream narrative. And another part of his legacy that really captivated me post-playing days is, we had mentioned, some of us had mentioned the newspaper columns. Well, he was also writing a newspaper column. He became, very political. He, became involved in, public exchanges with Adam Clayton Powell, the congressman, as well as Malcolm X. A lot of my work, one of the chapters in my book analyzes that particular breakdown and that exchange, that very public and vitriolic exchange between Malcolm X and Jackie Robinson in terms of, Jackie Robinson being called out as a sellout, as an Uncle Tom, etc. And it's just absolutely captivating. But that's not typically the Jackie Robinson that we are taught as kids, as students, as learners of his legacy. And so it's really that political Jackie Robinson, and especially that post-baseball career Jackie Robinson, that really captivated me, and a lot of my work focuses on that.
As I remember, just quickly, between Jackie and Malcolm, Jackie gave Malcolm as good as he got in those exchanges. He certainly challenged Malcolm as much as Malcolm might have responded back to him. Sridhar, what's your vision of having written in 42 today?
Well, I sort of came to him by accident, like David did. I was doing research for my first book, Year of the Pitcher, centered around the 1968 series, and I was not looking for him. I was literally not looking for him, and I came across a note about him and the suite at 68 convention, the Democratic convention, and Hubert Humphrey's speech or suite, and I started digging, and I found what a role he played in that race for Hubert Humphrey. And that's something you don't typically think about. And as Michael has written about, the post-playing days that we are taught, right, especially by the Republican Party, is that he was a Republican and he, supported Nixon. And it kind of ends there. And what I found is, especially in writing that book, and because it's based in 1968, that he was sort of my link to the outside world, because he had left baseball by that time. And there was so much going on, but he was going to be my anchor to baseball. And so it goes back to the end of his playing days, but he's such a complex figure, and I wanted to, and such a fascinating figure in that post baseball life. And so, it just intrigued me, especially that year, because you see the metamorphosis of a man who had believed in Nixon in 1960, and in the course of those 8 years had completely reversed course and had seen that vision of the Republican Party, and kind of a, obviously I wasn't around, but kind of a simpler version of America and a simpler version of the civil rights movement kind of fall apart. And that's how I sort of came to him. And since then, and exploring his relationship with, Malcolm and King and all these other things, I've really come to appreciate him as, I've used this term a lot, but as a power player within that civil rights movement, right? Because, walking out of it and, being there with the NAACP and the various organizations, he's everywhere, right? He's with King, he's with, just name that person. And you see these interpersonal conflicts. You see everything as time goes on. And he's just a fascinating character. And so, yeah, I just,
Yeah, I would offer that the history of Black athletes, good, bad, or indifferent, Black athletes, both women and men, had to be more respectable than other athletes. I mean, Black athletes couldn't behave in the manner of Ty Cobb directly. And so Robinson, in my opinion, is in the tradition of kind of respectable, the respectable politics of that Black athletes. One, he goes to UCLA. He has some college. He is an officer in the Army, but he reflected much of the early football players. The first Black Olympian is, again, who wins a medal in 24, is a college person from the University of Michigan. And so Robinson is very much so, but he's civic. He's very much civic minded. And of course, he's born 1919, so he is very much a child of the Great Depression, as well. So to think about those issues. What do you all think of in your reading of Robinson that's for our audience fun and interesting? I mean, what gave you a chuckle about Robinson in all your various readings of him? Any humor?
So in 1948, he takes off his glove during a bad call, and he kicks it. It goes about 30 feet in the air. And I thought, wow, I need to include this in my book for young readers to give them some sort of sense of the humanity of Jack Robinson. But I love that story. In fact, one of the black newspapers has a picture of it, and his foot is in the air. And then they drew a picture around the mitt, which is 30 feet in the air. So it's an expansive photograph. And I love that. There's also this great photo of Leo DeRocher, who's holding a zero up. He's holding his hands up like a zero to indicate that Robinson has a swelled head. And this is after they separate. And I love that as well. I included that in our new book, Call Him Jack. But the pictures of Robinson's humanity that come out even on the baseball diamond are absolutely amazing. And I found them absolutely humorous when I came across them as well.
Anybody else? Did you discover humor in Robinson?
I'd actually say that, I was looking for it and didn't find that much of it. And I think that he was pretty serious in his intent. He was making bones about retiring from baseball when he was an MVP caliber player because his body hurt and his body obviously broke down quite early. He was on a mission, and Carl Erskine has spoken about this. He came to the ballpark every day with an intensity not unlike Ty Cobb. I mean, Jackie was an SOB to play against, black, white, whatever color.
He was a competitor.
He was a real competitor, and he did what he could, and he yelled at you, and he came in hard. He did all the things that you should do as a great ball player, as an aggressive ball player. When you speak with Sharon and you speak with the family, he was very gentle and humorous as a father and in his personal life, one story that Sharon loves to tell that I always like is how he would go out, he would come home, a few weeks before Christmas with bags of clothes and lay them out on the bed, and then Sharon and David and Jackie Jr. would all go and pick out a few of them and put them in a box. They were men's clothes. They were shirts, golf pants, and they'd take them and wrap them up and then put them under the tree for him for Christmas morning. And then Christmas morning would come and he'd shake it. What could this possibly be? And oh my, I'm so surprised and all that, right? So he had a gentleness and a humor very much that way. But I think his public life, certainly civil, certainly, even when, David mentioned his speech at the end of in 1972, even when he was making a point, and Robinson was pretty much always making a point, he started off, the first part of that speech is, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to baseball. Thank you for Pee Wee Reese for being here. I owe to Mr. Rickey all of this, genuine, sincere thanks. And then he comes in with, and I'll be happier when we have a black manager, is essentially what he's saying. And I think that so anyway, that to me is his sort of some of the human qualities of him on and off the field.
Yeah, and I would say, to Kostya's point, there's probably it is kind of hard to find some of those moments of levity throughout his career, and you can certainly both on the playing field, in his political life, and in just in his personal life, and you can certainly understand why that might be the case. But I would say while I haven't really come across a whole lot of things that have made me necessarily laugh when it came to Robinson. There's two things that kind of stand out that make me smile. One of which is, reading about the exchanges, as we just talked about a little bit ago, between him and Malcolm X, for example. I mean, extraordinarily. I mean, you absolutely said it. They came at each other, and Jackie never pulled any punches. But there's this great photo that I've come across of him and Malcolm X, and they are both. It looks like they're just laughing. I mean, they're just absolutely, laughing it up. It's just this wonderful moment that you can just kind of see as a snapshot that captures again, the humanity of those two individuals who in public life and even private life, very, very, direct, straightforward, very serious, individuals who understood the gravity of everything that they said, did, whatever, privately and publicly. That's one. The second would be, I would say, when, it's not necessarily Jackie, but when Buck O'Neil, the great storyteller, recent Hall of Fame inductee, Buck O'Neil, right? The storyteller of all storytellers.
And we have a campaign at the museum going on for Buck O'Neil.
Yes, exactly, right?
All contribute your buck.
There you go. And so, when you hear, I was just watching last week, one of his appearances, I believe it was on David Letterman, and he's telling the story about Jackie Robinson and how, they're not able to, he's new to the team, he's new to the Monarchs in Kansas, he's new to the Kansas City Monarchs, and they're traveling and they stop at the same gas station that they've always stopped at, and the attendant let them get gas, but they didn't let them use the white bathrooms. And Jackie Robinson, this didn't compute, and the story goes that he put a stop to that, etc. Everyone on the bus were leaving, we're not giving them their business, and then of course the attendant changes his mind because he understands the business aspect of it. But the point of it being that makes me smile is Buck O'Neil, even in a moment like that, when Buck O'Neil also making a point about the gravity of the situation and the humanity of all of the different circumstances that Negro Leagues players found themselves in, barnstorming players across the country, Buck O'Neil himself has that ability to bring levity to that moment. Even though he's telling this incredible story and making a very serious point, just his ability to tell that story in a way that makes you smile, even though the emotion of it doesn't make you smile, his ability to recount it and tell that narrative and paint that picture and persona of who Jackie Robinson was as a person and as an advocate for people on his team, for people in his community, etc., just absolutely makes me smile.
Of course, Robinson was went to the military and he went as an officer, but it does raise a question of Robinson's educational level, even with 3.5 years of college, I believe, at UCLA, as compared to his fellow athletes who might not been in college. Have any of y'all thought about that? Because Robinson, to me, certainly is in a tradition like Paul Robeson, who we started off the conversation with, who is an All-American at Rutgers in football, finishes college, then goes to law school, et cetera, and goes to stage. Robinson is very much in this long tradition of these Black athletes attending universities around the United States as athletes. That's the way in. Have you thought about that in your research on Robinson? The meaning of education, because I'm struck when I watch college baseball today, how few African American players on the team, and Robinson was in football, and so was Robeson, a football player. Have you all thought about that in relation to Robinson? Was that an important dimension that we might highlight about him?
Well, I guess I would just say that then, and certainly now, there's just simply far fewer opportunities to get a baseball scholarship, right? There's about 5,400 baseball scholarships in the country. That's a fraction of what you can get in football or basketball. So if you're never mind like going to play for Alabama or Oklahoma State or whatever, if you want to go to Central Connecticut, you want to be able to get yourself an education through sport. You're not playing the best percentages to go in baseball. And certainly at UCLA, when Robinson went to UCLA, he was sort of recruited out of Pasadena Junior College to go to UCLA. Pasadena Junior College, he was a superb athlete. You mentioned earlier his ability as a track. He almost certainly would have gone to if there had been Olympics would have gone in 1940. But so I think that a lot of it is just that the opportunity is there. It's whatever, even college football is a much more attended, revenue-generating sport than college baseball. If you're planning your career, you're better off planning a baseball career, unless you want to end up feeling uncomfortable later in your life. But if you're planning a way to get to college and get a scholarship, there are other sports that afford that avenue.
I don't think I'd ever describe Robinson as an enthusiastic student, and it's important to highlight that he got 3.5 years at UCLA, but he did quit, and he quit in part because he really wasn't into his studies, and that drove Rachel pretty nuts. She wanted him to keep the course, to stay the course and get his degree, and he didn't want to do that. And he switched his major to history, he says at one point, because he couldn't stand science. He couldn't get it down. And at that point, which I love, as somebody who's interested in history, but I don't think I'd ever describe him as an enthusiastic student. And now that said, he became an advocate for education. And he marched in the Youth March for Integrated Schools, which is primarily about high quality education as he saw it. He inspired Rustin and even Dr. King marched in 1959 and the Youth March for Integrated Schools. So while he became a great advocate, he wasn't really interested in higher education for himself. And I don't think he ever really regretted not getting a college degree. My fellow panelists might know otherwise, but even when he was in high school and at Pasadena Junior College and later in elementary school, he wasn't interested in his studies, according to his family and those who knew him well.
Yeah, well, of course, those circumstances of those days, certainly he grew up pretty, a single mother with a bunch of kids, grew up pretty poor. So, and again, I mean, if you turn 10 years old or 11 years old in 1931, you're thinking about survival. And I think it's important for us to think about the context of the time that people are going to school. I mean, there's a lot more worries about taking care of family, the family situation, so yeah, and like a lot of athletes, which I got myself in trouble with my own university, I think. I wrote an op-ed piece about, like in the Kansas City Star about athletes suddenly find themselves having to be spokespeople, whether it's Wilt Chamberlain, it becomes a semi-advocate in Lawrence, Kansas for integration of the city, period. So I think that I just wanted to see is as a part of a generational thing, that he later comes along and says, well, education is important. Athletics will make money for him, and that's I'm not mad at that at all. I mean, I just saw Russell Wilson's contract today, guaranteed of $165 million, and I wish I had more athletic ability some days than being a university professor. Now, I some people will claim I'm brain dead already, but I think it's important just for us to give a broader dimension to Robinson, to look at him in relative to people who was around. I mean, Joe Louis actually, is the athlete, most well-known athlete when in the 30s, of course. And Robinson and Joe Louis spent time together at Fort Riley in just side of Junction City, Kansas, as they trained for World War II. So I'm just wanting to kind of raise as many dimensions of Robinson that I think we should be discussing. And yes, he's a very intense man, and I think the thing that we want to know and I think that only it was, Michael Long and I were talking about earlier before coming on air, the kind of more personal Robinson we don't get to see, and I would love to have a photo exhibition of Robinson with all of those various pictures that you all have found in your research. That would be wonderful to think about him in comparison to other people. What else do you would like you like to add to this conversation? I want to add one other thing. I wrote about religion in 42 today in Methodism, and I actually think that part of Robinson is one critic of it said, well, he didn't go to church much, but and I was like, well, he left a pretty substantial kind of spiritual autobiography in his own kind of memoirs that Michael initially wrote about and other things. But I do think Methodism had a lot to do with Robinson's character. It was a deep influence on him, and in terms of behavioral norms, he in the Negro Leagues, he wasn't the boys will be boys kind of guy and so forth. I wonder if you all thought about other dimensions of Robinson that you want people to know about.
Sridhar had an interesting point, I think, in 42 today about Robinson's legacy, and wrote a really nice chapter on Robinson being at King funeral. Sridhar, would you mind talking about that at all?
At King's funeral?
Or just his legacy in general. I see that there's a question here from Shayana Brown about what would Robinson's message to today's generation in the U.S. be? And I think you had some nice insight.
I think Kostya was going to say something, but I don't know. I mean, these are interesting times. At King's funeral, well, that I don't know if anyone's seen it, but the image of Jackie Robinson walking away from Martin Luther King's funeral is probably, of all the great photos from coming away from 1968, or great is a bad word for it, powerful photos, the one of Martin Luther King walking away from that funeral sticks out to me the most, because here's a man who's like not only lost his friend, but his sort of great traveler in life. And it's just so moving because they were in this together, right? And they had fought, but he never left him. And they disagreed on things, vehemently, including the Vietnam War. And you see a man who, he had seen a movement, and with his friend, he had seen a movement sort of pass him by. And so, when someone asks, what we tell the youth of today, I think like in 1968, with when he saw, King's passing, you would find Robinson sort of be at a crossroads himself, and he'd be struggling. But at the same time, he would listen, right? Because one of the most fascinating pieces that came out of that year too was after the Olympics. There was a panel of Black athletes, including Robinson. I think Bill Russell was on it, talking about what happened. And he said he couldn't have been more proud or prouder of Tommy Smith than John Carlos and their stance they took. And here was Robinson seen as reactionary by so many Black youths. And so I think he would be out, of course he would, be front and center of the Black Lives Movement, and he would be taking in everything that had happened over the past 4 years. And I think he'd be forefront, trying to for something great. And so I think he would, in terms of what he would say, don't be patient, right? Because that was the one thing. That was really the one thing that drove him nuts, right? Because everyone was like, just wait, just wait, just wait. And he's like, no, we're not waiting. And he would say, don't be patient, because it's your time, it's our time. And I think I think that's what he would say to the youth.
I couldn't agree with you more, Sridhar. I just want to jump in because I thought it was an excellent essay in 42 Today that you wrote. And I was thinking, what would I say to Shiana's great question? And that was, don't sit still, which is essentially don't be patient. And that was, we touched a little before about how Robinson was not afraid to disagree with people, even people he admired. And he appreciated Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, and appreciated what he had done with sending forces in to help with desegregation. But when Eisenhower said something right along the lines of Sridhar's talking about, like, just be patient, we're getting there, he was not going to have that. He would say, no, we're not going to be patient. And I think that if the other point about his closeness to Martin Luther King and education, just trying to tie together a little bit of what we're talking about, when Malcolm X died, it was a very sorrowful time for Jackie Robinson, even though he was, as he said, they were at each other and they had very different views. But he was on vacation and took a moment to write his column and saying the sky is a little darker here in Florida where he was on vacation, given this and he knew. And the one similarly with Robeson, I don't think that to his last days that Robinson regretted his stance, his anti-communist stance, but he did regret having gone against Paul Robeson, who was certainly also a fellow traveler in this fight in that arena. And Robinson was not, as Michael put it very well, he was not interested in formal education, but he was interested in education. He was interested in knowledge, in knowing, and having something to say based on what you knew. So he would definitely say, learn and act. Don't be patient. As Sridhar said, don't sit there and just yell at your TV or yell at your Twitter feed. Get out there and do something, make your voice heard. He, of course, had a platform, which he achieved through his athleticism. But I think he'd want people to be active for the right causes.
Yeah, I really like that last point. Robinson disagreed with Al Lee, he disagreed with Malcolm, he disagreed with King, he disagreed with quite a few people, but he always appreciated their ability and willingness to stand up and speak out. I mean, that was the one thing he really admired about Malcolm, his willingness to stand up and speak out. That's one of the things he really admired about Muhammad Ali, the same thing. And so I think generally that's advice he would give to young people. I think more specifically, though, and tying it to some contemporary events, specifically, he would say, stand up and speak out and fight unjustifiable police violence. Robinson was a victim of unjustifiable police action when he was a kid. When he was at Pasadena Junior College, just before he went to UCLA. Even after he became famous, a police officer assaulted him outside the Apollo Theater, and the police officer stopped only when somebody said, hey, that's Jackie Robinson. And Robinson writes columns saying, what would have happened to me had my name not been Jack Robinson? What about all those other people who don't have my name? He spoke out time and again against police brutality. He sided with the Black Panthers on this particular issue as well. So I think Sridhar's right. He would stand up with Black Lives Matter. And I think it would encourage kids today to stand up against police violence.
I want to just, again, being the historian here, contextualize, because I think one of the things that we see, unfortunately, with social media is that people can't have positions and publicly debate them as adults, right? So that we will go at each other on this particular issue. Afterwards, metaphorically speaking, we're going to go out and have a beer, or have a laugh behind stage. We might disagree with each other, and one of the things I came to appreciate about Robinson is that adult behavior, that we take opposite positions on these things. We are going to debate, and that was an era where. Maybe Americans were more grown up. They did debate and so forth. There's an interview with Paul Robeson, and I don't want to stick with this, but there's an interview with Paul Robeson Jr. that's interesting on YouTube about his father's reaction and understanding the position that Robinson has to take for publicly for this. So there are just lots of different ways. I think there's just a lot more to be done on Robinson. Of course, we all here, and I feel like the interloper here, because I've written on King and King's mentor, Maze, who was very influential on Benjamin Mays, on Hank Aaron. But the stories of baseball are so many more and so in depth, and it really really gives us insight. Not just it was America's pastime into U.S. life itself, and I think that's what makes this so Jackie Robinson so compelling, right? Is that he is this post World War II athlete. He's a veteran. He's a poor kid coming up, hard scrabble kid doing depression. He has the sense that of church and other things. That's a part of I like Kostya's work of those seasons of his life as a ways of thinking about it. And the latter season is to understand that young people aren't just wild-eyed radicals, but they have a great point, and so forth. Anything else you all would like to add? Because here that hasn't been said, or a point that you want to share with the audience.
Yeah, we've mentioned, several people have mentioned, you were asking about education, about Jackie Robinson's time at Pasadena Junior College. And, that was one of the first things where I actually kind of tilted my head when I was doing my research with Robert, when I was really learning about the man and the person in his life and history so many years ago, is that was the first time I actually found a direct connection with this icon. So he went to community college. I too am a proud graduate of community college, and I've spent the last 22 years in community college education. And so that was one of those first times where I thought, hey, there's this historical icon, and there's at least one thing that he and I have in common. We're both community college students. So I thought that was particularly fascinating to me, and that really just kind of perked me up even more as I delved into him. And then the other thing I would say is, we've talked about how, that question about what would he say today, to this generation. And I've written about this as well. And I think it's pretty safe to say, based on what's been shared and what we know about Robinson, it's pretty safe to say that we have a pretty good idea as to how he would think about certain issues today and what he might say. At the same time, he's almost kind of frozen in time, because he died in 1972, which is 50 years ago. As a young man, he was early 50s. I want to say he was about 53 years old when he passed away. And what we miss out on is how he would have felt and what he might have said with other things that came after he passed away. I'm imagining, what does a Jackie Robinson say about the Berlin Wall coming down? What does he have to say about your point about social media today, and how it doesn't really allow us for opportunities to dialogue? And I think we've talked about Michael's work before, but if anyone on the call, anyone who's listening to this has not picked up Michael's book, 2006 book, Jackie Robinson's Civil Rights Letters, it's just an absolutely wealth of fascinating knowledge about who he was. As you can't write these civil rights letters to all these prominent and even not so prominent people that he was a prolific writer, right, Michael? And they're so insightful, and there's so much grace and eloquence in what he's saying and the points that he's making. And no person can make those points as crisp and as important as those are, unless they are someone who truly listens, who really is interested in dialogue, even when there's a disagreement, even vehement disagreement, that there's always that genuine respect there, that we are pulling on the same end of the rope, so to speak. And so that's the Robinson that I really feel like, when we ask that question, what would Jackie Robinson say or do? We have a pretty good idea, but unfortunately we still don't really know, because we don't really get to see the evolution of his thought and his political leanings and his political views. Probably stay very much the same, like a lot of us, but again, we just don't get to see them continue to evolve or tweak or change or develop over more decades in time.
I want to just give a big shout out. So I am good acquaintance with Arnold Rampersad, who wrote the first volumes of about Jackie Robinson with Mrs. Robinson's permission. And Arnold's book is stellar, and I wanted to be known on YouTube that because I know Arnold when I talked to him, that I think that was a marvelous choice initially to write that. But there's still so much more to be written on Robinson, and of course one of the things one of the public things, Michael Long, for giving such a diverse group of people opportunity to write about Robinson from different perspectives. I think that's really important. So, but I found I remember when the Arnold's biography of Jackie came out, and I sat down and read it because it's personal family history is important for me in that story, because other people came along to my father was in professional baseball. So we got a couple of more minutes. Does anybody is something that I missed that needs to be offered? We now know that Jackie was and so
I'll only say that in the 75th anniversary that we're honoring him, the baseball is honoring him, I think that we have to take some time, because I think that the game that he helped change also is at a crossroads, right? And, I was in a panel last year about the state of modern pitching, and any baseball panel now looks inward on the game itself, and it goes to the shifts and what's going on with the game. And we talk about diversity in the sport and what have you. And I feel like, and, anyone who knows me knows what team I root for, and, in Southwest Ohio, that is bad. But, Eric Davis said this year that he doesn't celebrate Jackie Robinson Day, that every day should be Jackie Robinson Day, because, more Black players should, exist in this game. And there are a lot of reasons why. But I am increasingly concerned that he is frozen in time for baseball, and that April 15th is just that. And the game might just be stuck, right? It's not moving forward, and it has this increasingly, I don't know. It's a interesting time for the game, and I'm curious as the game moves forward that what Robinson does not move forward with it. So, we'll see.
Yeah. I guess I'm increasingly concerned about the Republican.
I want to give everybody a closing time to closing out comment. Thank you. And so Michael, and then we'll just go in that order. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'll talk about what I'm increasingly concerned about, since Sridhar has. I'm increasingly concerned about the Republican Party that did not become what Jack Robinson wanted it to. He really wanted a two-party system where Black voters would suspend their votes until they could decide on which candidate or which party would most advance first-class citizenship for all people. And he really made an effort to inclusivize the Republican Party, to push it to attract more Black voters, and really was heartbroken at the end of the 1960 campaign when he saw that the party wasn't doing that, and offered to work some more on that particular issue. And nobody really took him up on that. And I can only imagine where we would be today had the Republican Party followed Robinson's advice. It's sad that it hasn't. It's sad that the Democratic Party hasn't really followed his advice as well. So I'm increasingly concerned about the polarization of political parties, and I wish they had come together at least on issues of racial justice.
Kostya?
Yes. So I guess I agree with what's being said. One thing I will say is I do think that he had Michael sort of alluded to, part of the reason why he was a Republican was so Democrats wouldn't take the black vote for granted. He didn't want that to happen. But I do think we were talking about a different time, right? John F. Kennedy was beholden to the Dixiecrats, and he had lunch with George Wallace, right? I mean, it
was Franklin Roosevelt. So
yeah. Right. I mean, those guys were driving. Bull Connor, all those guys were Democrats, right, down there in the South. So he was part of what finally got the Democrats to break from them, right? And you'd see them win every state but lose the South because of that. And I think that when Barry Goldwater came into the Republican Party, Jackie was all hands off. Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater were both Republicans, but they were extremely different people. And I think Jackie saw through that and supported individuals. I'm not nearly so down on or pessimistic about the game of baseball. I think that there's a lot of good going on there. I think it faces a lot of challenges that pro sports in general, especially those that don't thrive off gambling quite as much as professional football are facing. But the point I really want to make is just closing point on Robinson. It's often said, like, did he have to be the first? Could somebody else have been? Well, there's no question that other players could have long before Robinson, right? Since the very first day baseball was played, African Americans were more than good enough to come and thrive in the league. So that goes without saying. It's obvious. But for Robinson and Rachel with him, so respected the position that they were given to be the first. And it explained why they were a little reticent early on the first few years. They were honoring it. They were coming in, and explained why he embraced it in a way that not every African-American ball player, Roy Campanella is a prime example, did. And he seized that platform and he seized that moment and really thrived with it. And I think we've all benefited. The country has benefited from it. And if it had been somebody else, they may or may not have done that. I think it was an incredibly fortuitous or beneficial thing that Jackie Robinson was the man who was given that opportunity, who seized that opportunity and honored it and went with it.
And I think that's a perfect place to close as we watch the Serena Williams in tennis and one of those breakthrough athletes as well. So, gentlemen, and the next time I hope the panel is far more diverse. But I do want to thank you because it's been a really great conversation. And I recommend to all the audience to pick up all of the work by these writers. There were writers that we should have had on that we didn't, but I'm very, very grateful. Thank you all very much. And I'll turn it over to Ray Doswell. Unmute.
You're on mute, Ray.
Sorry about that. I've been listening and trying not to make too much noise, but I want to thank you all for your time tonight and thank all of you all for tuning in. Remember, you can become a member of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum if you like this program and want to see others. Membership supports these efforts, and we appreciate all of you tonight. So thank you again to the panel. These are all good friends now of the museum, and we want to encourage them to continue to support the museum and keep writing about Robinson and other figures of import in sports and in our history. Again, I'm Raymond Doswell. We thank you for joining us, and all have a good evening. Thank you.